A teapot?
For everyone who's starting to gather, we'll begin at 2 o'clock. Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Megan Rohrer coming to you here from Grace Lutheran Church, and we're having our weekly town hall to minimize bias in the Lutheran Church. Today, we're going to be speaking with Angela Jenkins, who is calling in on her phone today, so you won't have video of her. For those of you who are joining us in the Zoom webinar, you will not have video or voice in this conversation, particularly because we are focusing on listening and because we want to decrease the potential that people will try to intentionally disrupt this conversation in ways that would be unhelpful. If you would like to have conversations with each other, share links with each other, please use the chat function here on Zoom. If you would like to ask a question that you'd like to raise up for our conversation and for Angela, please use the Q&A button here on Zoom. If you are watching us on the Facebook live stream, you can just type any questions that you might have in the chat section. As we spend this time listening, we are reminded that technology is fragile and that all of us are human. And so if there are hiccups in this conversation, that will just be something we live with and maybe even celebrate our humanness through. For those who haven't been a part of a Zoom call where someone's calling in rather than doing video, I'll let Angela talk a little bit about why that's an important choice for her, and I've actually heard that from a number of folk in community, and so that'll give us an opportunity to learn more about that choice. And I also want to lift up, as I do each week, that as we are having this conversation together, as we are speaking together, we do it as people who are speaking from our own individual context, and because it's recorded and archived and put out there in the world, it reflects our opinions as of September 18th, not necessarily forever on and on into the future. And with kind of that spirit of conversation and listening and community, I would like to invite into our conversation Angela. Angela, would you be willing to introduce yourself to folk?
Okay, I'm Angela R. Jenkins. I put that out there because there are several Angela R. Jenkins in the Bay Area. I'm a native of California, and I came up to San Francisco about 30 years ago. I'm a graduate of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. My degree is in Black Studies. But it's about 3 years ago, living here in San Francisco, that I observed racial profiling or feeling stigmatized when I walked in my neighborhood along Mission Bay and South Beach, right outside of the Warrior Stadium and right outside of Oracle Park. I've lived around that area for about 21 years, so I'm apt to ride my bike in the area and enjoy the beautiful scenery, but still felt that burden and heavy sense on my back that I wasn't incorporated into the community as everyone else was. So I met with a group called Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is an ally group made up primarily of white people, white identified people, who feel they need to stand in the gap between police brutality, outright animus against black people, and try to be the barrier between the injury that may befell people of color. That white ally group finally manifested into the group we know today to be San Francisco Showing Up for Racial Justice. We just recently were invited to a panel with San Francisco's Human Rights Commission to speak on our perspective of bias by proxy, or when community members are deputized to be the police, policing without police, or how the community contributes to bias policing without the police even being near. So I think that gives a brief introduction. Is there anything more I should share?
Do you want to, since this is often a gathering of people who are churchy folk, do you want to say anything about your history with faithful people?
I was raised in a Black Baptist church. When you use that, it's synonymous with a Pentecostal church. There were times that I know that I was brought into that Black Baptist church as a baby, and people get the Holy Ghost and start shouting and singing, and I would pray, oh, please, please, don't let them get the Holy Ghost around me. It scared me too much. So I know the Bible very well. I've studied it we were accredited with being good Christians if we went to children's church and memorized all the books of the Bible and as much as we could. And I still hold that faith today. I still have a faith in doing the things that don't harm other people. Our group, SF Interrupting Racial Profiling, is based on interrupting things online and in real life that do harm and injury and stigmatize black people or indigenous people of color. So today I'm practicing the good faith of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But in reality, Jesus said that you have to love your brother as you love yourself. So that's how I go. I'm really steeped in a strong Christian faith. I never even learned how to dance.
I don't know that they taught me to dance either, but maybe that's because, Lutherans we're kind of a sway kind of people. I guess maybe it depends on where in the world you are as a Lutheran. I'll let people argue about it in the chat box if they learn to dance.
Yes, and I was also, in this army, I served as a chaplain's assistant. In the first Gulf War, I was deployed to Saudi Arabia and spent time helping both the Catholic and Protestant chaplain. I would sing and lead. I led an Easter day service. So that also is extended into my life, too, how I manifested my faith into somewhat of my career when I was in the military.
I love that. And you kind of opened up the conversation a bit to talk a little bit about bias by proxy. For those who haven't heard about it a lot, do you want to tell people kind of about bias by proxy and maybe about Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt?
Let's see if I can weave the two together.
Yeah.
The way I understood it is when Megan and I were on the bias work group, we had some great practical practitioners who were either attorneys, who had lived experience, and some were law enforcement officers that are aware of how the everyday citizen, the everyday community member, doesn't necessarily walk through life innocent of their own bias, launching police onto blameless black and brown people. Jennifer Eberhardt, when she looked at a lot of the work she was doing in comparing policing and comparing how often police pull over people, also came on to implicit bias that was in herself, in her son, and in many other people. So implicit bias will drive the eyes of someone to not look at a white suspect, Dr. Eberhardt says, but turn their eyes away from a white suspect to a black person. We are all focused on black skin and associated with criminality or threat, is what she said. For our definition, I believe the Department General Order, which is what we've been working on for more than a year, now includes a subparagraph that defines bias by proxy, any civilian intention to phone and make an emergency call based on the fact that they don't like the individual. It isn't based on that there's a real emergency. As a matter of fact, Supervisor Walton here in the City and County of San Francisco is preparing to announce the proposal, the change of the ordinance, and he called those types of calls bias by proxy calls when the individual doesn't really witness a crime taking place. They have buried prejudice against an individual, and they'd like the law enforcement officer to sweep away that individual or keep them out of their community or out of their sight. So Supervisor Walton created the Karen Act. The acronym stands for Caution Against Racially Exploitative Non-Emergencies. Let me say that more correctly. It's spelled C-A-R-E-N, and it is a pun on the word Karen, and it stands for Caution Against Racially Exploitative Non-Emergencies. So bias by proxies is just making the police your customer service, and usually it's happened by wealthy, privileged people doing that when they see black bodies in places they don't want them to be there. Our group, San Francisco Interrupting Racial Profiling, actually looks at things that are online, such as in Nextdoor, the app Citizen, and we find pockets of people doing that very thing, imbuing innocent people with criminality who are simply doing everyday mundane things. So our group has put together some practicalities and ways to find that and uncover that and to stop that trend. And we've authored legislation to do it. And the Karen Act is kind of what we were looking to come forward. So bias by proxy is simply using the police as your customer service to dispel people you don't want in your community.
And it may shock you to hear this, Angela, but bias by proxy is also something that's found in faith communities. I don't think it will shock you to hear this. And trying to figure out what to do when there are complaints reported to councils or grievances that happen that are also centered in a bias, how to respond to how to take complaints seriously, but also to not enact bias on others through a complaint process or through a grievance process or through a discipline process is something that I think some congregations have been working on for a long time. Some congregations are new to, and I think is just something that is I think something all faithful spaces are going to need to be aware of, because in the same way that you can report things on places like Nextdoor, any community group is a place where bias by proxy could occur. Is that your understanding too, that this is a phenomenon that can happen in most any community?
Well, I'm going to follow the outline you gave me. We just spoke about community. Eventually we'll move to we haven't been to the individual, but we're in the community speaking of bias by proxy. In my understanding, the term that I understood, and when I was first in the bias work group, I'd asked for the Board of Supervisors as well as San Francisco's Police Department to look at the community's contribution to bias, to actually measure it and to define it. So I would say bias by proxy is meant to be in lieu of. So I think it has its definition inside of policing, that the individual, there's a substitute for police. It still has the same impact as policing. That is imbuing an individual with the personality of suspect and criminality. I do want to leave bias by proxy in the sphere of policing, of public safety, of security, because what I believe you're talking about is just implicit bias. Hidden bias is in all institutions. The country was founded as people don't realize that Dr. Condoleezza Rice actually said that the country has a birth defect of racial inequality. She's known to be a conservative, outwardly a Republican, but she grew up in what was then called Birmingham, Alabama. She grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and was friends with some of the the women that were killed, the young girls that were killed in Birmingham, Alabama. So Dr. Condoleezza Rice says there's a birth defect of racial inequality. The nation never overcame the fact that it sees certain populations as inferior or less than human. So I would say it's implicit bias when we speak outside of public safety, regular implicit bias, hidden bias, unconscious bias. It infects all sorts of institutions. How do you feel?
I appreciate that separation because I never know when a term that is being applied to one organization can be applied to another organization. And my guess is that the reason for differences in conversation is because it's not very often in congregations that implicit bias ends up with someone who is deceased, right? And so there's a different level of urgency and emergency to conversations that are about policing. And is that correct? That would be one of the reasons we don't want to interchange those terms and keep the focus on policing right now?
Yes, it was, if I remember her name, she used the word profiling by proxies. Many of the people have been writing about it, and it is in the level of people who are authorized by the Constitution to detain or identify someone who's doing something that could harm others. They have the right to intervene and check on someone because of their behavior, and they alone are doing it. But we become deputies of the police. One writer works, Dr. Benjamin from Princeton University. We become deputies of police when we remove the police and we decide that individual can't walk, cannot move without our escort, without our eyes being on them. That is strictly in the realm of public safety. Bias by proxy is strictly in the realm of public safety. I would leave it there. For the others, it's what Dr. Jacqueline Battalora would say it's a competency. If you're in an institution and your privilege is making you unaware of your ability to spew toxic exhaust of microaggressions against people of color, then you lack a competency to function in that institution. Dr. Jacqueline Battalora used to be a Chicago police officer. She got her law degree and then became a doctor of philosophy, got her PhD, and does what she calls white competency. And that she's much like Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and Robin DiAngelo focuses on how white fragility, the inability for people of privilege to talk about their internalized racism. But getting back onto the point, they are different things. It's a competency to be able to function in privilege and not spew a toxic microaggression exhaust every time you breathe and maneuver. But bias by proxy, I think, should stay in the realm of policing.
So bias by proxy would apply to faithful situations when those faithful situations are, if there was an instance where they were trying to discern if they should call the police given any incident that's happening in their space.
It's putting yourself in proxy of the police. The police, right now, San Francisco's police department has an article that was exposed at the last commission meeting that's saying the police pull over more African Americans than any other group. But those are driven primarily, more than likely, they were driven by calls, by service calls. I have to look it up. I do know that in the last quarter of 2019, the number of suspects reported to the 911 or to dispatch were near 50% black. 50% black. It was 47. It's a big, stark difference considering San Francisco is still just under 6% Black. So instead of police going up to Black people, the community is coming to that 50%, 47% calls coming to San Francisco's police department and saying, there's a Black suspect, they're doing something. So that's still in the realm of safety. Black people are pulled over from police believing they're suspicious, but also a large percent are from calls coming into San Francisco's police department. It's a regular trend that it's near 50%, even in the first quarter of 2020. In this second quarter, I think it was at 44%. Nearly half of all calls coming into dispatch are reporting a Black suspect. That's not looking at 311, which is a non-emergency. So yes, the community puts itself in place of the police to identify what they see as criminality. In institutions, it's the unawareness of whiteness and privilege that causes harm to people of color. And Dr. Robin DiAngelo just calls it white fragility. They're actually microaggressions. As I say, they're very similar to microcarbons that tax the atmosphere. Every privileged person can admit microaggressions that harm people of color.
Would you be willing to, microaggressions are small, they're kind of like small ways that kind of add up? Would you be willing to define microaggressions a little bit?
If I can, I hope I can.
Well, best you can, right.
Paper that's out there that describes it. It comes to psychologists when they're working with interracially with people who are experiencing the toll of being Black in a white society. It's the everyday mundane. It's incessant. It doesn't stop. It's the locking of an automatic car door when you walk past. It's not being able to step into an elevator because the woman inside is clutching their purse at your presence. It's waiting in line and having another individual pass you by who has skin privilege. Like even today, when I receive my groceries, I'm always having to say, yes, I am Angela Jenkins. I'm not trying to steal these because I'm Black. These do belong to me, Mr. Delivery person. Please don't take my picture. I am the person that's supposed to receive these groceries. All those add up, and they do become a toxic cloud at the end of the day, where scientists are saying these daily microaggressions of imbuing people with fully melanated skin with criminality, with mental deficiency, with intellectual deficiency, actually drives up the blood pressure of African Americans. In one study called Unnatural Causes, it isn't because we eat salty foods and fats, it's because we have to wade through a wave of indignities like that on a daily basis. That they prove that when we lay down and go to sleep, our blood pressure is still the same as compared to people who haven't endured that toxic exhaust of microaggressions all day long. Is that clear?
Yeah, I really, I really appreciate, because I've been the benefit of a training that you have led along with your organization, and our chaplains have had some of your trainings, and your language that compares some of these microaggressions and implicit biases to exhaust that kind of comes out, or to ways that a carbon footprint builds up, for me is really helpful to kind of see not only that there are ways that I'm polluting the world when I participate in biases implicitly or explicitly, but also to think about, if I can wrap my head around trying to decrease a carbon footprint, there are ways I can wrap my head around trying to be better as an individual. Would you speak a little bit to how individuals can can work on addressing and minimizing their biases?
Well, let's see if I can say it. I heard someone during the onset of COVID describe internalized bias or hidden bias in the individual. We're all terrified that that virus will someday come into our lungs and take our lives or impair us in some way. The woman said that this is the best way to move forward, that racism is like COVID. One, you have to believe it's real, it's out there. Two, you have to act that you have COVID, and you have to listen to those people who know most about COVID-19. So racism is very similar. One, you have to believe it's out there. Two, you have to believe it's more than likely you have it and will have it. God forbid that we do. And that racism also can best be detected by people who are the victims of racism. So for the individual, it's best to never deny it. It's hard. It's very difficult to believe we're not good people, but the individuals that are the recipients of our, let's call it flagellants, our privileged flagellants, they can tell that foul odor is not really good. And the best thing is to think of it that way, that there is always an ability with skin privilege to live in the world and not be cognizant of how that living in the world will be taxing for other people. So that's what I would say to the individual, that believe you have it. Read Dr. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. Become cognizant of the fact that without your permission, you became part of the white world that unconsciously taxes black people with privilege exhaust. Okay?
Yeah. So naming it and not denying it is a part of the journey, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything that minimizes it other than acknowledging it?
There's a lot of things that.
Yeah.
I like to always say I've been a jack of all trades. I was actually well, I won't go into that one. I was a jet engine mechanic. I trained as a jet engine mechanic. I was a power generator mechanic. I've been a chaplain's assistant, and I had done some athletic running when I was in the Army about 100 pounds ago. I say 100 pounds, not 100 years, 100 pounds ago. I was an athlete. But the one thing that minimizes any of it is watch the non-verbal communication of a person of color when you come by them, if you happen to run into them. The one thing is that most people of privilege don't have black friends. They don't have black friends. They don't interact with black people. That's the reality. But should you come into the presence, and these days it's not likely we'll be talking face-to-face and seeing the nonverbal communication of someone except on Zoom, that you read it. Unless you're invited into that person's space, be aware that that person's body is preparing to be assaulted by a microaggression, preparing for the person of privilege to say something, do something. And the best way is to make sure that body language of the person of color you may physically come into has been inviting you in. Read the eyes. If you don't make eye contact, don't think smiling at them is going to make it nice. Read the eyes. There was a passage here I wanted to read, and that's the biggest thing for me, is the paternalistic sense that black bodies are available to people of privilege anytime they want them, anytime they want to. It's quite the opposite. The individual way to maneuver and to actually have what is it in the Bible? A sweet fragrance is what it says. To have a sweet fragrance and not be toxic to people of color is to read the body language. Wait to be invited. Wait until there's a nod. Don't believe you have to go online and look at every able-bodied black person moving in your neighborhood. That's how I would say it. Give this privacy to people of color, knowing that they're preparing to be assaulted by the toxic exhaust coming their way. Okay?
That's also part of why I appreciate that you called in today. And when you do presentations like this, you often call in rather than providing the video. And I know you do that for a number of reasons, but I think it's a really good modeling of the fact that you are able to name and claim and speak that your body and the video of your body isn't something people should just always expect, right? And that you can show up in the way that is consensual for you. And so I just wanted to name and appreciate that about you, that you enter this space and this conversation in a way that honors your needs. And so I'm grateful for that.
Well, I think you asked me to speak to it. It's just that I am not a person that believes in technology that much. I believe that we need to reduce our technology by at least 50%. The one thing that I say is that there's nothing that compares to engaging in all five senses. And also the privacy issue is that I don't invite people into my space unless I know they have my best interest in mind. And today I heard, actually, there was a seminar with psychologists, doctors of psychology. They were all black women, and they said basically the same thing, that we, black women, are thought to be, mistakenly so, the strong, fearless type, and that we have vulnerabilities, but we have to define when and where we engage and at what level we engage. So the psychologists are saying the same thing. We define when we want to have to, like I had to wear armor when I was in the first Gulf War. I had to have a flak jacket, had to have a Kevlar helmet. I had to have all sorts of things to protect me. So when women of color or any person of color is prepared to move into a world that has created a hostile environment for them, they want to be ready to do that. And it's by their own choice. We want to be prepared when we're ready to engage. At the same time, all of my in-laws are white. I have an in-law coming today that's bringing me over some groceries, a blue-eyed blonde. All my people I've dated, two of my partners have been white. Some of my counselors are still white. It's not that I exclude any person out of my life. By bringing people that I know are safe and whose body language shows me that I have the right to engage them, and it's not paternalistic and believing that my body is there for their use. So I'm not online today because I am a very private person, and when I choose to be, you can go to my website. My picture's up there on my website.
Yeah, and I guess that's something that I have appreciated about you, is that you're willing to talk about these things and share the wisdom that you have in a pretty gracious way, because I know the world's not always as friendly to you as I wish it was. And so I'm always grateful when you're in conversation with me. I always learn a lot. And so I'm really glad that you're here in the ways that you're here. It makes me really happy. So.
Well, thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. We've talked a little bit about communities and ways that communities can decrease bias. Are there any other thoughts that you want to share about, like, how a congregation could work to minimize its bias as a collective group?
Collective group is to continue to invite trainers in, people whose job it is to skillfully guide people down a narrow path, which is frightening to actually look and deep and see, you know what? I don't have empathy for black people. I have empathy for dogs. I have empathy for all sorts of animals. Oh, I'll adopt any pet. But to have someone guide people down to that revelation, that's how a community or congregation can routinely have someone each quarter come in until people feel more comfortable talking openly about the deep seated bias inside the community, the congregation, and also an assessment. Why aren't there people of color coming to the Lutheran Church? Why aren't there people in our congregation? Are they comfortable? Do we need to have a black caucus? All sorts of things like that. Any institution that looks at its absence of people of color, or is it suitable for people of color to come there? We all know it was Martin Luther King or others that had said the most segregated hour is the church hour on Sunday. It still is. So if you're asking me how communities can do it, introspection, and be cognizant of how you're perceived in the world. It's so easy to never know what your relationship is to people of color. Dr. Jacqueline Bactalora, as I said, you can search her out online. She has her website. She's the one that brought that up in a video that I saw recently. And I love the way that she described the lack of empathy. She said that she'd come home, it was, I believe, when she was a law enforcement officer in Chicago. She's watching the news, and she said, 4 white people were killed. And she said, oh, my God, this is so bad. And then the media went to, and 3 black people were killed, and she lost interest immediately. And so she went down, and she was sitting and watching TV. Then it occurred to her, wow, I really didn't want to hear about the black people. And she had to do that introspection. I have empathy for animals. I have empathy for beluga whales, she says, for all these things. But my lack of empathy was the condition of whiteness, is what she called it, condition of whiteness, of being privileged and lacking for nothing. So it's always introspection. A community can always look deeply into itself, in my opinion.
And
these are all my opinions and my living experience. And the study of unconscious bias is what I do. I try to read and be up on these things.
Yeah, and you didn't promote yourself in that, but I hope as someone who has seen you in the world and respected you in the world and really appreciated some of the ways that you have come and taught in the basement of my congregation, I want to really highly recommend you, particularly for those who are watching from the Bay Area here, because you have an exercise where you can actually help people, like, privately do a worksheet to try to examine where some of their implicit or explicit biases might be. And that introspection time with some kind of communal discussion time, I think, is a really valuable resource for congregations that are looking for some training. So,
yeah, that's good. It's an inventory. We're trying to make it proprietary, and we're trying to keep it somewhat exclusive to us, but there are similar models out there. We're working on another tool like that. My group and I, San Francisco Interrupting Racial Profiling, we do enjoy engaging people. I'm sorry, I'm getting so excited about that I'm stumbling over my words, but engaging people, because it has to be constant. Another similar faith group would be the Fellowship of 12-Step Recovery. They say that you need to do a fearless moral inventory. You do it on a routine basis anytime someone's claimed that you've harmed them. So looking deeply into ways you've stepped or some way your breath has injured someone else, it's supposed to be routine. It's supposed to be a part of confessing our sins. I said I wouldn't say that to you, but I love quoting that passage. And
yeah, I'm glad you did.
1 John, it says, you can't be in denial. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So inventory is mandated in the scripture. A look at how we are connecting with others. It's tradition in the Catholic Church. You're always confessing your sins. So for people of privilege to be cognizant of the way we live in the world, or person of privilege lives in the world, is done through an inventory. And yes, that was a tool we use that we're developing and trying to keep it exclusive to our group.
Yeah, the words of confession that you lifted up are words that are commonly read in Lutheran liturgy and in many liturgies. For some Lutheran congregations, they proclaim those words at the beginning of every single service, that we are kind of woefully entangled in sin and cannot free ourselves by what we have done and by what we have left undone. And it leads me to believe that for folk who are regularly having those words of confession, that making sure that time of confession explicitly talks about issues of race and the white privilege that many of us carry, I think is important to be really explicit about. I don't know if you know this, Angela, but the process of confession in the Lutheran Church, we do less of the individual confession. We do that privately with God. But in our worship time together, we do communal confession. And it's supposed to be for times when we have contributed to systemic injustices, like ways that we have sinned as a community, which is perfect for what you're talking about in terms of doing a community check-in on what we're up to in terms of racism.
That sounds excellent.
Yeah, another thing that has recently been lifted up in our Lutheran community and is currently being led by a Black queer pastor in the Lutheran Church named Lenny Duncan is a call for reparations for Lutheran churches to contribute funds that would go towards supporting Black Lutherans now. And you might or might not be familiar with like the Black reparations conversation in the Lutheran Church, but would you be willing to, I know I just brought this up now and didn't give you a heads up, but would you be willing to talk about why reparations is an important part of kind of conversations about how to address white privilege?
There's several ways to move forward. In a practical sense, my group, San Francisco Interrupting Racial Profiling, and a group we spawn off of and were inspired by and guided by, Neighbors for Racial Justice in Oakland, actually does a practical sense of reparations when they teach community members about bias on online groups. When they explain to people, this is prejudice, this individual isn't doing anything, don't call the police, they are paid for that. One form of reparations is getting equal pay for the work they've never gotten paid for. So one is paying people when they correct you, guide you, give them a fair wage for the work that they're doing. Just recently, reparations people think of as going back to the ones that were promised after Reconstruction. If we remember, Reconstruction was a period after the Civil War when we were going to rebuild the nation as one union. And it was a time where Black people were finally coming into society, coming into their own. As some of you may know, it was the first time we had Black senators and Black representatives. So in the time of reparations, they were promised to some degree the ability to be self-sustaining, 40 acres and a mule. That's how some people see it, that there must be direct reparations from the free labor of slavery given directly to descendants of slaves. But in modern times, reparations can be like the city of San Francisco is doing in reallocating budgets from San Francisco's police department into long underserved communities. That can be a form of reparations. For me, when we're speaking of reparations, when someone schools you in your unconscious bias, you should pay them the full fee for that tutoring.
I love that. I love that. I think that's real, is because we sometimes think about, or at least I'll speak for myself, I sometimes think about there is a way in which when critique happens or when someone says, hey, you have wounded me, there is an ego that I carry that sometimes will say, ouch, I have been hurt by this conversation. And on my best days, I silence the ego and I listen and I learn how I have affected other people. On harder days, the ego maybe talks out loud and doesn't listen as well as I ought to. And I love this idea that when we are able to kind of take our fearless moral inventory, that we can do personal reparations for the times that we have learned the places we've been out of step, and financially make that a part of how we're stewarding to others. And maybe that helps us change the way we're thinking then about when someone shares a way that we have harmed them, we can think about it as our opportunity to give back and to thank a teacher who has taught us about where we need to work on our bias, rather than only thinking of it as us being injured because someone told us about the injury they have. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you remember, several years ago, there was a website. It started on Facebook called Reparations Me, and it was run by a Black artist. She just had an opportunity to marry up people who were privileged, predominantly white, and if you needed to go to school and you were Black, that individual would donate your tuition. So what you just described, it has been practically used. I don't know if Reparations Me is still available as a website, though, what you just described, to some degree. So, yes.
So no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Making amends is like when you do a lawsuit, you want to be made whole. Making amends isn't the same as reparations. Making amends is at least acknowledging wayward behavior that, if not interrupted, would continue to injure another person. And that's all needs to be done. In the fourth step inventory, it says we continue to take personal inventory, and we were wrong. We promptly admitted it, but we continued to do it. And in looking at it, we do a continuous living amends. I know that if I do this, if I come up to my friend whose hair is just so wonderful and I want to touch it because I've never touched a Black person's hair, if I remember the time they told me, don't touch my hair, and I consistently make that amends, I never touch that person's hair again. I don't commit a microaggression. So in living amends, you're just repairing the injury, the immediate injury, or the injury that had happened. Reparations was more to quell the economic gap, the inequities in finances. The inequities of structural racism kept African Americans poor, kept African Americans out of proper housing, from education, all those things. That one, reparations would restore people to what they could have been had Reconstruction been successful. Proper education, housing, opportunities, proper medical, access to medical needs. So I see them different. Making an amends is just a personal way of living your life without harming others, where reparation is addressing the institutional harms. Some degree. That's how it could be different.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a really helpful way of thinking about, particularly because there's a need to do both, I think, right? There's this historical damage that continues to cause symptoms in our world, and for Black Americans and Black people around the world, actually. And there's kind of this one-on-one repair work that we need to do just to be community as we work forward in the world, and maybe to expand our friendship group, and to do the things that need to be done person to person, right?
Yes, it's hard. It's very difficult because, as I say again, I don't want to make a mistake in saying that no one has Black friends, but our interaction with African Americans is going to be, people who are privileged interact with African Americans very, very, very rarely in my experience. And I'm the one and only in my particular condominium complex, the one and only Black family. And I know I stick out, and there are things that come with being that. So when you have the ability and you do have someone that you're interacting with, yes, saying I'm learning, please be honest with me, I'm willing to learn. And again, read the body language. Are you invited in? Are they bracing themselves again for an attack of unwanted hostile environment just by you noticing the African American person or wanting to engage?
Yeah, I've heard from a number of people who have been listening to kind of this series. I think this is our 17th listening session, thinking about ways that we can minimize bias. And one of the things that I hear pretty regularly is that for some folk, they live in communities where there doesn't seem to be much diversity. And so trying to develop those natural patterns of friendship feels a little bit harder for some people. And so what they've appreciated is that in some ways they feel like they're listening into the kinds of conversations people can have when they have that friendship pool. So again, I continue to be grateful for this conversation and all the people who have shared their voices as we've listened over these weeks. Our
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said yes. Our Lutheran Church is organized so that we have local congregations, we have geographical clumps of congregations that are called synods, and learning the names of these things isn't necessarily the most important thing, but I'm just describing it so you can kind of imagine the ways that we're a larger system. So we have small geographic units that are called systems, and they have bishops who kind of help communicate and have some overarching responsibilities of like deciding which pastors get recommended to congregations for jobs, and helping with the process of who gets to become a pastor and what are the steps on the ladder that they walk up in order to become a pastor. Some of that is defined by the larger national church, which kind of oversees all of the evangelical Lutheran churches in the United States. They set some guidelines, and then these local synods can live out what it means to work through some of those guidelines. Both the synods and the national church print resources, have groups that provide special input. They have proclaimed since 1989 that we want to be a more diverse church, and have endeavored to do that. However, Pew Research has said that the Lutheran Church, ELCA, is the whitest of all denominations in the United States. And so there is, since that report came out, a concerted effort to try to figure out how this overarching body can help decrease bias and increase diversity. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how this larger system can work to decrease bias.
Well, you asked me that. The first thing is to say, if people of color are sensitive, if I'm an African American, I'm going to be attracted to somewhere where I say again that I don't have to feel a hostile environment. And I don't know that making it diverse is actually accomplishing the mission of the church. The people will go where they feel comfortable. One person that's written about, when we talk about racism, we talk about the call to reach out to people with the message of Christ. I don't know if it's important for the church first to convert people. Is it talking about converting people? There are plenty of black churches that will convert people to Christ. Or is it to be a congregation, to be a community? But one of the writers that I studied when I was in school, College of Ethnic Studies, getting a Black Studies degree, is Derek Bell. He's an attorney, and he proposes that racism is very permanent. That bias is something, anti-blackness is something that we really may not ever overcome. And going back to Dr. Condoleezza Rice, the birth defect may never leave us. We may always have that scar. So I don't know what you're really asking for. If you're asking for African Americans to thrive, practice and worship in their way, then maybe there would be black caucuses. Designate the small group of people who are in the church to bring others in through the avenue of a Black caucus, where they know they'll be comforted, sheltered, and not endure a hostile environment. If that truly is your mission, if your mission is to save souls, other churches are doing that. But if your mission is to really be united with one's community, then you have to face the fact that racism may be very permanent, it's very hard to overcome, and that if you are going to try to diversify, you have to begin by giving the independence and definition to the Black person. Let them define what they want to be in their community. I had a passage that I was going to read from a person that may answer this and may not, and it is away from paternalism. Don't want to discourage Lutheran Church from looking at its demographic and wondering, should it change it? I will encourage it to first do so through the leadership of other Black people inside the church and not take on the responsibility that there needs to be some intervention. So I'm going to just read what I understand, and it says it's the key to racism. And it's when and where you engage someone, and it could be underneath the umbrella of paternalism. So I'm just going to read the passage, and I do think it fits into, is the Lutheran Church needing to make something more diverse, or maybe not? It's from an author who's in a special group. The author says, "This is such a key part of racism in relationships. White people feel entitled to interactions with people of color where the people of color are not able to set the boundaries or set the terms of the engagement." They went on to say that they had an interaction with a person that they met, and they said, "I told the individual I was not socially available to them or to other white people, but because this woman had done personal work around racism, she didn't get outraged or dump her anger on me. She respected my boundaries." I think in creating diversity in the Lutheran Church, respect the boundaries of the Black people who've chosen to stay, who've chosen the Lutheran Church. Let them create a Black caucus if it's needed, and it would be independently run by Black people to define what environments are comfortable for them. That's what I see moving forward. And if you get a chance, look up Derek Bell. He had a really deep, deep sense of how to solve the problem of racism in America.
So if a congregation wanted to work on this, but wanted to follow your advice, which is to follow Black leadership rather than creating something, would something like reparations or just putting financial support into the Black Lutheran churches that already exist, into the Black theologians that are already leading, into the organizations that are already forming caucuses, do you think that that's something that would be a better use of our efforts than to
recruit people to get your rainbow?
Yeah, that was I'm thankful you gave me that language, because I was trying to figure it out. Like, so it's less about like fishing to try to get people to come into our specific buildings, particularly if our buildings don't necessarily feel safe and comfortable for folk, but being alliance builders with the communities that might already feel safe for people, or might have already been experiencing the effects of that historic way in which money was withheld in the past. Does that kind of make sense?
It sounds like a great idea, but I am not a Lutheran pastor. I do. When you ask me that, I could speak from my experience of interaction, but it may be perfect. Wasn't it was it Georgetown University? I get them mixed up. James, the university whose Jesuits found a direct link to slavery and who went directly back and paid restitution and reparations to the descendants of those slaves and gave them free tuition to their university. That may be an avenue, but I'm not the person. You have to go to your Black caucus and ask them if they think that's a good thing. But it is great that you would ask for the voice of people most impacted than to design it in outside of the leadership of of African Americans. It's important to let us define what we need, define what the problem is, and then invite certain people in to resolve it. It's giving us the power, as this woman was saying, that white people feel entitled to interactions with people of color, where the people of color are not able to set boundaries or set the terms of engagement. It's always easy to be invited in, to read the body language, to read the aroma coming off of the person, the black leadership, and let them make the decision. So my choice, I suggest you just ask, is that a good solution? Georgetown University, I may get the wrong, but one of them did do reparations.
I'm taking piles of notes here, and then I'll look up all the stuff you mentioned and try to put links to the in the video for those who are watching in the archive, if that helps. We do have a question. Oh, someone says it was Georgetown, so there you go. Thank you, Bridget. So we have a question that's coming from one of our viewers, and I think they're trying to take in what you're saying about body language and caring for people. There is a white Lutheran who has read white fragility in their small church. There is one black member married to a white person that's going to begin studying Dear Church next week. Dear Church is a book that was written by Lenny Duncan, who is a black queer pastor who's addressing the church and saying, these are the things I want you to listen to. So they're going to be reading that book. It says, I do not drive, I walk a lot. I usually smile and wave or speak to people as I pass. Is that okay, or is it a microaggression?
If you read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, she specifically says that smiling at black people and being nice to black people doesn't really solve racism. If it's to everybody, if white people aren't suddenly, what they say, becoming exoticized, I don't know if that's the word, the exotic new thing, if it's not going out of your way, if it's even across the board, you're smiling at everybody that goes by, but you're stigmatizing the white person if you're broadly making their presence known and that you see them. It's so much easier to be introspective when seeing that black person comes by, walking by. My reaction, oh, there's a black person, and looking deeply into what are the thoughts that rush into my mind as I see them. Do I feel fearful? Do I feel that I need to smile to say that I'm not a racist? Am I trying to say that I'm not a racist? The easiest thing to do, again, if they make eye contact, read and let know in everyone's mind, probably, for me, purposely, I am waiting for that onslaught of either fear, right, or just passing by. So it's nice if you smile at everybody that's going past. Ms. DeLand, Robin DiAngelo said the same thing about the same stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm trying to navigate as a parent, you know, Angela, I have 2 black children. And one of the things that we're trying to work on is to not, like if you only have white dolls to play with, sometimes people think that white bodies might be better than black bodies, right? So we have a diversity of dolls that are being played with, and we try to pay attention to, you know, is how the dolls are being played with, like, are all the white dolls doctors and all the black dolls are something else, and trying to like think about that with our kids. I sometimes, now that everything's on Zoom, I've been trying to figure out like which names of the other students did you learn, and if my kids only learn the names of people of a particular race, if they're only learning the names of the white kids, how can you learn the names of all the kids? Just to try to, like, in their childhood learnings, to try to think about ways that we can kind of make all of the bodies known that they're beautiful and that they're all worthy of dignity, and that we're always expecting to meet someone that we love and care about, regardless of the skin color of the bodies that people are encountering. And I know you're not a parent, but do you have any advice for parents who are trying to help raise their kids, trying to minimize ways that they might learn some of these things from a young age?
You know, I'm glad that you qualified that. I am not a parent. I've been a pet parent. I had 2 kitties, but I can, and they were both black, black and white. I can only go back to my childhood, and I do want to qualify that I think the smartest person I know knows what they don't know, and I'm not a parent. What I can say is that when I was a child, I remember taking out Crayola crayons, and very similar to what you described in skin tone and diversity of bodies, shapes and sizes of sex, genders, or non-conforming genders, that when I took out the crayon, my parents being from the South, I was ready to color. And in the Crayola crayons, there was a crayon called Flesh Color. And I took it out, and I looked at it, and I finally just said, wow, I like periwinkle, but what's flesh color? And I asked my mom, I said, what's flesh color? And she got this painful look on her face. She never really answered me the question, because when I was raised, flesh was only one color, and that was white. And that Crayola crayon, they just recently made a change to that in this year, in 2020, began to get diverse colors inside of its box, and saying, which really announced to the whole world, there's only one flesh. That flesh is pink and it's white. So going back to my childhood and reading my mom's body language, I know that I was deprived of really seeing people that looked like me manifest in the most popular toy children had back in those years, that universal box of Crayola crayons. So I would say that exposing people at a young age to things that confirm who they are, their skin tone, the way they identify by gender, or don't identify by gender, is very important. That's the only lived experience I can share. I'm not a parent.
I remember it was really moving to me when we watched during Advent one of the movies about Jesus. Maybe it was Jesus Christ Superstar. And my kids, one of the ways that they express kind of the ways their body is different in the world is they sometimes wish they had straight hair rather than curly hair. And when they watched this film, they went, wait, Jesus has curly hair? Yeah. And I've never seen them so excited that Jesus had curly hair. And it was just this reminder, like we had always said, yes, Jesus was black, and here's some pictures of what Jesus looks like, and had try to talk about that as often as possible as a way to kind of celebrate their bodies and the icons of our church definitely are of black bodies rather than of white bodies. But there was something about it in the movie that they like maybe didn't believe me until they saw it, that like Jesus had curly hair and they had curly hair. And a little bit later, one of my kids said, they were like combing the hair or something, and they're like, just like Jesus, right? That their hair was just like Jesus's. And there's something about having ways that people can identify with the sacred and not see their body as deficient in some sort of way that I think is just good for people's self-esteem. And so I just want to lift that up there for groups that are watching movies or are doing churchy stuff, that to have some of that imagery be as diverse as the people whose bodies are in the room or you wish were in the room can be an important part of that process for folk. Have you had any experiences with church communities who have kind of shown you that decreasing bias is possible? Because I think you said a little bit earlier that maybe diversifying congregations isn't the goal. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, most of the churches that I went to, I was raised in a black church, but I did get involved in some of the Calvary Chapel churches down in Southern California. And a lot of congregations I attended were predominantly white. I concede to that when I attended churches in my youth. I don't know that I've been in churches that really made me feel extremely welcome or could overcome implicit bias. I want to still stress that I was a part of a nonprofit, a recovery nonprofit, and it was rife with anti-black bias, so much so that I had to leave it and left trying to ask for changes. Work, everywhere I've been, there's the institutional bias. There's the individual bias that leads into institutional bias that leads into systemic racism, all of it from a structural to systemic racism. I can't say that I've been in a faith group other than being in a black church. I went to one of the black churches here in San Francisco that I really felt alleviated from the pangs of not fitting in, that there is anything, something that's worked. It may remain the most segregated hour, as Martin Luther King said. I've heard him on my sermons that I listen to sometimes in the evening. So I can't say that. I say it's always going to be a constant struggle. Because I always look to see if people are willing to do an inventory of their privilege, not to say I don't have privilege because I'm poor. Just recently, the Census Bureau looked at, if you read it, I don't know if you follow the news out of the Census Bureau, they looked at marriages between same-sex couples and heterosexual couples and found out there's a gap there, that same-sex couples make a lot more than straight couples. That myth, they used to say it was a myth that same-sex couples had a lot of disposable income. Well, it's true from this recent census notification. So how do I bring that back around to, there's always going to be privilege. Skin privilege is very well manifested in the gay community. And economic privilege has been manifested then with this new census thing. There's always going to be this wealth gap, opportunity gap that I don't know will always fix things. That trying to recruit black people, try to ask them to come into a church or be there. You always meet people where they are and let them define what's comfortable for them. I guess that's how I'll say it.
How has that experience of being someone who has kind of various intersections in your personal life kind of been for you in the world?
It's difficult. I've had some of my most oppressive, heart-wrenching injury from gay white people, gay white ladies. Horrible, horrible. I remember going into a coffee shop, and I'm a person who's never raised my fist in anger to anyone. I've lived here 30 years, never raised my fist in anger. I've never broken into a car. I'm a strong, celibate person. I don't get angry or steal. I don't do any of those things. Yet when I went into this coffee shop, this gay white lady was waiting on me. She was a barista, and I'd been there for 10 minutes, and she looked at me up and down. Maybe she noticed I had a laptop. I had a cell phone. I made a little bit of money back then. She looked at me as if to say I stole those things, and then she said the strangest thing. She looked at me and said, "Crime doesn't pay." And I want to ask her, are you talking to me or are you talking to everyone else in this line? Only phrase she could say is, "Crime doesn't pay." Are you calling me a thief? I wanted to say. I didn't say those words. But some of the deepest accusations and separation and stigmatization have come from gay white ladies. It's just heartbreaking for me. They're more than that.
I'm sorry you've had that experience. I just really am. I know I can't fix it, but I'm just so sorry. Yeah. On a slightly different subject, I have been really curious and wondering if metrics and data gathering would be useful to help minimize bias in churches. You spoke a little earlier about some of the ways that metrics and data gathering has helped to quantify bias in conversations about policing. And I have often wondered if there was data about what are the demographics of people who make it through the psychological evaluation that Lutherans have to take before they can try to become a pastor. What's the demographics between who passes internship, and what's the demographics of how many people graduate from an MDiv? What's the demographics of how much debt people have after the seminary? What's the demographics of which calls, which congregations bishops recommend to people, right? Because bishops get to send names to congregations to interview. So who gets recommended for the jobs that pay the most? Who gets recommended for the jobs that have the most members? Who gets, right? I have been wondering if metrics and data reporting would help us think more about the ways that our hiring practices and our education practices might have bias in them. Do you have any thoughts about that as someone who knows a lot about metrics involved in looking at solutions to maybe decreasing police bias? Do you think that might help?
Well, they're very similar. First of all, I do have to qualify again.
Yeah.
Smartest person I know knows what they don't know. I'm not an expert in institutions. It sounds like it's the same thing that happens at the police academy, what you've just described. If you follow Officers for Justice, they're the black, we would call it, union for officers inside of San Francisco's police department, and they saw the same things in education and training, going through the academy and passing tests. They had to actually mentor a lot of black officers to get into San Francisco's police department. That I might know a little bit about. But you might call on Mr. Lenny Duncan. He would be more expert at that than me. I don't know, other than a little bit of hanging around San Francisco's police department and knowing that's the areas, as you're saying, where people fall off, and how measuring that and how it happens may be essential to trying to increase the percentage of people participating, to find where there are failures. Like, could there be a lot of indebtedness from college loans that prevent people from coming in fully? Again, it's not my expertise in your particular church. I know just a slight amount of things from speaking with the Officers for Justice.
Yeah, well, I would just say, for example, we have in our synod, the Sierra Pacific Synod, our local gathering, if you want to become a pastor in this synod, you have to go past the psychological evaluation. And currently, all of the therapists are white, male, and heterosexual. Right, so there's no kind of data or information about the effect that might have had over the last decades to only have therapists who are white, male, and heterosexual, who are the gatekeeper before the gatekeeper in the hiring practice. And so
sounds like you might be onto something. I think you should look into it.
Yeah, I'll have some conversations with Lenny and see what we think about that. Maybe being, I know it's been something that has been unhelpful for the LGBTQ community, because for a long time therapy had put sexuality and continues to have transness as a psychological disorder. That's changed for the L and the G and the B community, and so that's just been one of the obstacles. And so I appreciate you always pointing me towards the Black Lutheran theologians that we have who are able to speak more to the center of those things. Well, one question that you might be able to speak to that I like asking folk is there anything that people ask you that you would rather that they Googled and learned on their own?
I remember this one, it might come up. And it's, yeah, I don't know if they can Google it, but why do you think that I'm a criminal? That's a big one. Have you ever seen me break into any car? It's the biggest question. Why do you think I'm a deviant, that when you see me walking on the street in this community I've lived in for 21 years, I've worked and lived in for 30 years, my biggest concern is, why do you think I'm up to no good, or why do you think I'm a criminal? That's the one that just taxes me, and I don't think they can Google it. I think what they can do is just slow down. Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt found that there is some friction between rushing to judgment onto who's doing something that's threatening or a crime, is to slow down, put yourself in their shoes. Is it something you do on a daily basis, like walk on the sidewalk? Is it something you do on a daily basis, like jog in the city? Is it something you do on a daily basis, wait in a parking lot, only to have the police show up and point their guns at you? These are all 911 cases that have come up recently. So why do you think I'm a criminal? Put friction between that assumption if you see an African-American person doing mundane things. Slow down and put yourself in their shoes. That's the one that's always my pet peeve.
Yeah. One of the questions that folk have is, if imagine that one of our listeners was in that coffee shop with you, is there anything that someone could have done as a white ally that would have felt helpful in that moment?
Yes, the team lead should have told the individual to that barista, that's inappropriate to ask the guest. That's if she was a team lead. And there are people who are trained in intervention when they see hate emerge, and usually there are several options to do it. Usually you distance yourself from the person perpetrating the harm. The ally would distance themselves from it and engage the individual and say, that was a dumb question. I don't know why she asked you that question. I don't know. I'm sorry she asked you that question. But you distance yourself from the individual doing the injury. That's one way to intervene. And other people who consider valuable the black business would say, this is wrong. I'm sorry this happened to you. There are several ways to do that. The employees themselves should have caught it and intervened unless they believe, like that individual, that this appears to be someone coming in here stealing things or has stolen this laptop and cell phone. Or the kind thing, as an ally, if you can read the body language and the individual seems to be welcoming you in, their eyes and gestures say, I'm hurting, I would like someone to say something, then you start to say, that was a dumb question. I don't know why she asked you that. To engage solely and put a bubble around the victim of the targeting, put a bubble around them, distract them from the injury that's coming. These are taught in intervention on hate when you see it and witness it. That's how I understand it.
So would part of that recommendation be that people who are interested in intervening seek a training? Right.
There are a lot of courses on, I think they come through Surge. I've seen them actually in several places in San Francisco, how to intervene in a hate incident. They may be part and component of unlearning white supremacy or unlearning white privilege. They may be a component inside of that, but there are courses that are trained at. That one is online, and you can search it out, how to be an ally when you witness a hate incident. That one is something they can search out.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'll find that link and post it. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think faithful folk should be thinking about in times like these?
Always the same thing I started with the black lady that said, treat racism like COVID. Realize that it's real, it's out there, that you likely have it, and only the experts can really treat it. Listen to African Americans when they say, your slip is showing. That's a code for saying your racism is showing, or you really said the wrong thing there. I would say listen hard, very intently to African Americans when they point out something that makes them feel uncomfortable. Don't put up your defenses right away if someone is bringing something to your attention. Be respectful. Take it home and digest it at your comfort level. So we started with that. That's what I would pass on.
I love that. Well, I have been super appreciative that you have lent your time and your wisdom to us. If people want to contact you to talk about a training that could happen, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Would you forward them my email?
I will. So
Harry Jenkins, that's a good one.
Yep. So if anyone is interested in reaching out to Angela or the groups that she works with, send me a message and I'll connect you all via email. Sound good? All right. Thank you so much, Angela. I hope that you have so many blessings that that it starts to heal some of the years of microaggressions that I'm sure have just been a toll. And I'm always grateful to learn from you, and you're such a blessing to our community that you were able to share your wisdom today. Thank you so much.
And you and your family have been a blessing to me. I love watching you with your children. So God bless you as well. Okay.
Yes, thank you. They're smiling and they're enjoying the fact that my jacket is very soft right now. I feel like a stuffed animal. So people.
Oh, it's so wonderful. Yeah. Okay. All right.
We'll talk. I'll talk to you next time.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.